Okay, today is September 4th, 2022, and we have two very special guests on the show today, Robert King and Professor Angela Allen Bell. Robert King is a former member of the Black Panther Party, an author, a political prisoner, an activist, and a dedicated lifelong advocate for political prisoners, prisoners' rights, and oppressed people across the world. Robert King was one of 3 political prisoners held in Louisiana State Prison. They were known collectively as the Angola Three. Robert King was held in Louisiana State Prison for 31 years. 25 of those years, he was held in solitary confinement. Despite overwhelming evidence exonerating him, King received a life sentence. King's tenacity in proving his innocence came to fruition when a federal appeals court finally found him probably innocent. And in February 2021, after 31 years of imprisonment, 29 years of continuous solitary confinement, King was thankfully walked out of the gates of Angola a free man. From the moment of his release, King has worked tirelessly to spread the word about the innocence and the continued plight of the 2 remaining comrades. King has spoken at universities, conferences, and other venues. He has made appearances on the radio, television, and traveled all over the world, and even addressed members of the European Parliament. King has advocated to help win the release of the Angola Three, of his Angola Three comrades, and helped win their release. And he continues to fight for the release of all political prisoners and abolish the prison industrial complex. Professor Allen Bell is an attorney, law professor, and activist. Professor Allen Bell is currently a law professor at the Southern University Law Center, where she holds the B.K. Agnotri Endowed Professorship. I hope I pronounced that name somewhat accurately. Professor Allen Bell is a respected legal scholar, an expert on constitutional law, civil and human rights, social, restorative, and transitional justice, and the interplay between race and justice. It was her research that catapulted the movement that successfully ended the use of non-unanimous juries in Louisiana in 2018. And she is one of the founding members of the advocacy team that led the effort to reform Louisiana's jury system through the adoption of legislation requiring unanimous juries in criminal trials in Louisiana state courts. She has the distinction of having worked on several other historic advocacy campaigns, such as the Angola Three case, the Soledad brother John Clutchette case, and the case of Robert Holbrook. When in January 2022, Louisiana Governor John Bell Edwards issued a posthumous pardon to Homer Plessy, Professor Bell was selected to speak as a historian for the occasion. The House of Representatives for the legislature of Louisiana has commended her for her, quote, achievements as a legal scholar, and has recognized and recorded the, quote, tremendous pride and honor that she brings to the state of Louisiana. And Professor Bell is a recipient of the National Civil Rights Conference Civil Rights and Social Justice Award. In 2021, she was named by the Drum newspaper as one of its people for 2021. And in 2022, she was selected through a national search as a member of the first cohort of the Culture of Health Leadership Institute of Racial Healing. She was also chosen for inclusion in the 2022 inaugural edition of Louisiana Leading Ladies publication. Professor King, Robert, hi, Mr. King, you can hear us?
I can hear you now. Yeah, again, I can hear you again.
Okay, well, King and Professor Allen Bell, it's an honor to have you both on the show, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having both of us.
Good to be here. Yeah.
Well, so today I really wanted to dedicate this show as a tribute to Albert Woodfox. And my first question to each of you was when did you first meet Albert Woodfox, and what was your first impression of him?
I'll let King go first.
Well, you're asking me a question that dates decades back. Even before I met Albert when he was about 18 years old. I could fast forward this concept, so at the time, he was just a youngster running around and doing things, that other youngsters do at that age. And he ended up coming to prison. And I met him around that time. So I met him at that time. And during that time, he was not, as he, ultimately became politically active. He grew up after some years in prison, and he ended up getting, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I'm just trying to give you an idea as to how things happen. It wasn't always like that. I met Albert when he was a person who was not politically involved. It wasn't until some other time that I met him when he was in his 20s, and I met him in Angola, ultimately in Angola, but I had been reading about him. I had heard about, him becoming affiliated with the Black Panther Party, and that he had ultimately left and went to New York, and that he had came back and he was arrested, and he was in the past prison, the same prison in which I was being held at this particular time. Giving you fast forward things, I can't give them to you in the years that happened, but these are things that occurred. That Albert and I, we met at one point when we were both non-political, and then at the second time we met again in the past prison some years later, we both were more mature, and as I alluded to earlier, Albert decided to, when he was arrested on a charge, Albert decided to take matters into his own hand. I imagine he felt he was being deprived of something that he cherished, liberty. He's a young man still, and he escaped. And he went to New York, and this is where Albert said he met the Panthers. He saw brothers and sisters doing some things. By this time, the Panthers had emerged. And this attracted Albert to it, and he dedicated his life from that, just fast forwarding things into the future. From that point on, he fast forwarding his life into the future. He dedicated his life, to the ideology of struggling, after recognizing that he at one time was considered a predator, and he admits this totally to his community, and that after becoming politicized, he realized, what happened, why things were the way they was, and he did something about it, and he continued to educate himself and other people. And Albert, when I first met Albert, I didn't have those impressions of him. He was a rash young man, running around, but in some years later, I saw him again, and he was a mature individual, carving his a lifestyle out. He had begun to, to get over that boyish attitude and mindset, and focus on the condition that he lived in, especially living in the sixth ward in the neighborhood in New Orleans, where had a lot of crime and a lot of stuff going on, and he understood the struggle. He understood how people, were destitute. I mean, he put these things together, and I think he formed a concept about it. He became politicized after going to New York, escaping, feeling that he was being deprived of liberty and freedom. He decided, to take his freedom, and he took his freedom by at least, that I use that in quotation. Temporarily escaped, but he did something that very few people do. I have the gumption and audacity, to do. But he not just escaped, but he also became, politicized in that. And while he was in solitary confinement, I came back in a connection with him. We reemerged together. I was at that same time while he was doing things. I was being rearrested and being carted back to Angola, and then I remember, some of the same thing that attracted him. I was being held on the fifth floor in New Orleans prison, where I had escaped, and I wasn't politicized at this time, but I had escaped, and I remember seeing some of the stuff that Albert saw on the television. I remember seeing these brothers and sisters who were in a shootout the first shootout in 1970. September was 1970, I think, and it was the first shootout. And I saw those brothers and sisters, and I was amazed. I had heard about a lot, about Malcolm, Elijah Muhammad, so many people wrapped around. I heard about all these folks, but this was something new, and I had. It was something that was. It told me I heard that it was a shootout that was taking place in a night war with brothers and sisters, and I got captured by that. But anyway, that captured me. I began to study, began to understand, all the people before the Panthers and what the Panthers represented. I understood exactly. I embraced the concept of the Black Panther Party, which was, a concept of democracy. I think they were one of the people who got me to realize that democracy was colorblind, and after reading all these other books, J.E. Rogers' book, Nature Knows No Color Line, and where color went all across the place, they didn't pay no attention to it when it comes down to, the nature of it. But just like nature knows no color line, democracy knows no color line. It's neither black, white, brown, or gray. It's, Albert realized this. And as a result of realizing this, and he may not have been able to put it in context or frame it that way at the time, but it would amount to the same thing, and he decided to embrace something, and he embraced something that I decided to embrace. And, it was good that we did get back together. I'm still fast following it. I can't give it all to you, but I'm trying to give you enough. I know time is of essence, and I know Professor Bell is waiting to get her turn, and I would like for her to do it. But when I get to talking, about this, I mean, there's so much that can be said, and so many can say. And I know I'm doing this because I know if the shoe was on another foot, so to speak, if it was me, Albert would be saying something. He would be saying some of the same things, some of the same impressions. But Albert was, to me, in summing up, Brother Ryan and Angela, Albert was, to me, he was part of my backbone. He gave me courage to do some of the things that I would not ordinarily have done while I was in solitary confinement, because we faced some brutal people, and who was trying to crush every political, things that were going on that didn't impact their control of the prison. And so they were pretty brutal. But for me to go on and for me to have the courage, I knew Albert when I see he was part of my backbone, he had part of my back. He gave me the courage to move forward, not just physically when I had to, not that I did it on my own. Sometimes they force you to be physical and you had no choice. But he gave me, the courage to be physical, but he also gave me the courage to pursue the intellectual. I understood where we were, and I understood that we needed to get away from it, and I took it upon myself. I thought it's my duty. Some are given certain things to do certain things. Albert was given to give me what I needed, the impetus that I needed to go forward. And so in turn, Albert needed to get out. Herman needed to get out. And so combined, we just got together and we just put our minds together, and we decided to do things that the Black Panther Party say, because all of us embraced the Black Panther Party at that time without even having to say it. We embraced it wholeheartedly and fully, and would have wasted no time had we all been in the street. But because we could not do it, we decided to try to live it out where we were. Even though we were in prison, we felt that we could struggle right on, and we did, and we paid for it. But we had I think we had a mindset that we were innocent, and that what we were doing was right, that it was moral, and legality and morality does not meet. And we decided to go the moral way. The legal way wasn't, even though it was legal, it wasn't morally right. So, and I think this is where our ideals are ingrained in morality, the morality of our condition as a whole. And we saw it individually at one time, but over the years, we began to see it collectively. And we understood that it was not just us collectively, but it went way beyond us. It went beyond the shores of America. And we understood democracy in its true sense. Now, again, I'll say it again, that democracy like I say, it's colorblind in democracy. You know, neither black, white. But if it's anything else, if someone tells you that there's a democracy where they only include black, brown, and other people, it's a hypocrisy. It is not a democracy. And also, people need to understand that democracy is not a conclusion. You know, yeah, it's constant. It is ongoing. You don't enter into one phase of a system and go into democracy. People power. People make up that power. And I think Albert understood this. And I began to understand that. And we gave each other what was needed, you know, for each other to grow into where we were. Like I said, he gave me the impetus, he gave me the backbone, you know, and the courage to do something when I needed to do it. And I imagine if it was he talking or Herman, he would probably say something similar.
Well, thank you for that explanation. And don't feel, at least from my side, don't feel rushed whatsoever to answer. It's an honor to have you here and to talk about what you know about Albert Woodfox. You know, so don't feel, at least from my side, don't feel rushed in any way. Everything you say is a treasure, and so please don't feel rushed. And thank you for that explanation. Professor Alan Bell, what was kind of when did you first meet Albert Woodfox, and what was your first impression?
Certainly, but before I respond, I want to also say to Mr. King that you have earned the right to have the floor, and so you take it, and it is an honor to yield to you today. I'm just so thankful as well, not for your presence today to memorialize Albert, but for the years of work that you did in this campaign. And not only did you do it, but did it in an ingenious way, because I entered the campaign and a lot of my growth with this was because of King's ability to direct something this big and to know how to interact with people of different talents and skills. So it is an absolute honor to yield to Mr. King this morning. But in terms of me, I entered this story through a very different door. I was a recent law school graduate, spending the very first part of my legal career working in an appellate court. And oftentimes when a high profile case would come through the doors of the court, there was the media coverage, it would be taped to the walls. And so I saw some year the story of the man who had been held in solitary confinement. At that point, it might have been 30 years. And then years would go by and I'd see another story on the wall about that man in solitary confinement. Now it might be 36 years. So I often wondered what happened to those men. I wonder what could have caused the state to want to house them under those extreme conditions. But my work in the court required me to maintain a level of anonymity, right? So I couldn't take public positions. But when I left that court and transitioned into academia, I was tasked with being a researcher and a presenter. And so I had always said to myself that when I had that moment, this would be my first research project. And that's how I entered this case. So you asked about the impressions I had of Albert when I first met him. But actually, I'd started researching this case around 2008. I met Albert in 2010 for the first time. And at that point, my impressions were already formed. So this was a little in reverse order. So I didn't meet him and form an impression. My impressions were formed when I met him. And I'll tell you how that happened. The record in this case was so compelling. And it was largely because of each of these men. They did not sit and become victims behind these walls. They continued to litigate on the criminal side. They litigated on the civil side, and they developed a record that was just an amazing account of an injustice. So when I got involved, I didn't have a position to take. I didn't know any of these men. I was a neutral force. I just wanted to find the facts. I wanted, as a constitutional law scholar, to understand, is this even constitutional to hold people under these terms of confinement? I wanted to understand things about due process. When they went for these reviews, is this legal to deem this due process that you keep saying every 30 days, every 90 days that these people are gonna, that they're getting a review is what the records were saying, but the reviews were in fact very hollow. So after reading these records, what emerged from this was clearly this was extremely unconstitutional, the civil aspects of this case. I never intended to be involved with the criminal aspects of the case, but the record was just so irrefutable that I knew I had a calling to do something about it. So when I met Albert, my interest was not in trying to find out if he was a victim of the justice system, because I had long concluded he was. My interest was in figuring out how, in fact, I could help him. So I would like to tell you that I came to help Albert, but truly Albert helped me, because I understood from the work that I'd done on this case, something about law that law school never taught me. And what law school taught me was that I should have a reverence for law. And it taught me that as a country, we believe in a rule of law. This case and my relationship with these three men helped me understand that everything about this record described them as violent people, as predators, as people who were harmful. But in truth, it was law that was doing the violence. So law was actually harming these people. Law was used as a weapon against these three people. So I emerged from the work that I did on this case with a very different appreciation of law. And I understood from my work on this case that victims are not only created by predators on the street, that victims are actually created by our justice system. And so I went on a crusade very unexpectedly and definitely not intending to be working on the criminal side of this case, but to undo what I thought was a legal injustice. And I am extremely proud that I took a moment in my busy schedule to stop and render this type of assistance. And I would urge people listening to understand that there are many more Albert Woodfoxes and Robert Kings and Herman Wallace that need the kind of support that Albert was able to generate over the years.
Thank you for that. And I guess my next question for those in the audience that may not know is, can you both tell us, who the Angola Three were?
King, would you like to speak to that?
Angela, you're doing well. You learned out there well. Will you speak to it, please? I'll give you the floor. If I need to come in at any point, I'll come in.
Okay, that works out just fine. So we're talking specifically about three men who were actually strangers to each other. We're talking about the late Herman Wallace, who was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. The late Albert Woodfox, who was born and raised in New Orleans, and Robert King as well. And these men, as King said earlier, were strangers. They were not friends for many years, but they became friends because of their separate incarcerations. And so once they ultimately met, as Malik Rahim often tells this story, they were placed on a tier in Orleans Parish Prison at a time that New Orleans wanted to crush and neutralize the presence of the Black Panther Party. The mayor actually made public statements that they were not going to take on life in New Orleans. And so you saw an effort to criminalize that chapter for doing extremely legal things, right? And so one of the things you'll find if you go and read those appeals is that the Panthers were more law-abiding at that hour in New Orleans than was the city officials, the police department, the mayor, the government. And I say that for this reason. When they decided that they were going to try to remove them from occupying this apartment unit that they were in, the Panthers did something interesting. They actually ran to the court and asked for an injunction. And when I read that, I thought this is extremely telling, because these people could not be law offenders. They couldn't be anti-government, because what did they do? They went to the government and asked for intervention, because in that injunction request, they said, we are afraid of a confrontation with the police, meaning not that we want to hurt them, but we're afraid they may try to hurt us. That is extremely telling, and that is a matter of court record. And something else that's in that court record is this. The officer that actually went to that house to make that arrest misrepresented to the magistrate who signed the warrant that there was a cause for him, in fact, to even need a warrant. So a warrant was obtained on a lie. That lie led not an officer, but military equipment, manpower out to arrest them and take them into custody that morning. They were shot at. And interestingly, they were not treated as victims that day. They were treated as criminals. And so they were charged with multiple offenses, including attempted murder. And they were placed into a prison, and people will see the facts and believe that they engaged in some type of violence with the police. But there's a context to this story that needs to be understood, which is that the police was really the originator of everything violent and everything illegal that transpired that day. But something beautiful comes out of this story, which is that once you take those original Panthers in New Orleans and you lock them up, they are now ultimately meeting up with Herman Wallace, who is not interested in politics at that moment, Albert Woodfox, and then ultimately Robert King. And they begin, the administration thinks that by putting these three men on this tier, at some point, they're gonna just get into a confrontation and cancel each other out. But something beautiful happens out of this, which is that they begin to study together, and the Panthers begin to teach them some of the principles that drove their work. That 10-point program introduced them to the idea of Black men actually not being predators upon their communities, but having a mission and a purpose, and being about community empowerment and transformative work that makes people's lives different. And so when we talk about who they were men who individually became politicized and made a choice at that point. And their choice was to be public servants, and they were unpaid public servants, right? Because when we think about public servants, we think about the people who get elected and get the checks, but these were true public servants, because there was no check and there was no election. There was hell and there was suffering and there was pain. And they did it out of a spirit of uplifting people. And I want to stress that, because one of the misrepresentations I was always given about the Panthers is that they were anti-white, they were anti-government, they were anti-everything. But as I've learned the work that they do, it was always a human rights struggle. And we diminish the legacy of these three men or of the Panther Party when we don't speak about their work as human rights work, because that's what it was really about. It was about making sure that there was a quality of life that every single person that walked this earth experienced, and it was noble work, and it was honorable work, and most importantly, it was unpaid work. And so when these three men entered the penal system in Louisiana, they did something beautiful with these Panther principles that they had learned, which is that they took a position that if we're gonna be housed, we're gonna be housed humanely. If we're gonna be housed, we're not gonna watch people prey on other people. We're gonna end this cycle of predatory behavior. And so to understand what they did, you have to understand the timing of the work. So Angola segregated at the moment that they arrive at Angola. Angola, as we know, sits on a former prison plantation. As we know, that prison plantation dichotomy is present in every aspect of Angola, which means that when you see men working on those fields, it is very much like the way you would see on a plantation, with Black men doing the labor, the agricultural work. At this point, when they were in Angola, the white men, inmates, were actually given weapons, and they were allowed to be guards. And so you'd see Black inmates doing the agricultural work and these white inmates sitting on horses with weapons, able to shoot them if they don't work those fields. So this is the Angola they were in. And so they wanted to educate other inmates, and I'm stressing not just Black men, but other men, so that they understood that we actually are a community here, and that we are not going to be exploited as we do this time that we have to do. And so they introduced the idea of defense classes so people could protect themselves. They formed an anti-rape squad so that they would not be people there being victimized by other people, which was not always the imagination of the justice impacted folks. Sometimes the prison wanted to see these types of victimizations occur because it was the way they managed the prisoners, which is hard to reconcile, but they were fighting a system also, right? And so another thing that they did, in addition to the physical education, they did political and intellectual growth classes, ultimately starting to train themselves to litigate. And these are people who were not educated people before they went to prison, so prison became a house of education for them. They resisted the idea of being institutionalized, and they are to be credited for not just filing frivolous suit, because that is not what they did. They filed suits that transform conditions, not just for them, but for the multitude. So you would see them ultimately making some impacts when it comes to those hearings that these inmates are going to now be submitted to in the future, so that when they left prison, there was some change in the way hearings are going to be conducted. It wouldn't just strictly be done by way of administrators. It would now involve a broader base of folks in those decisions. You would have seen that when they first were placed in solitary confinement, they were fed like animals. Food on the floor shoved under the cell as if you were feeding a dog. And these men understood that they had dignity because they were humans, and they litigated to actually have the cells where that food could be put in through those slots that were waist high so that they could be fed with dignity. They litigated over the conditions of solitary confinement and brought this conversation not just to a national space. So we would ultimately start seeing the US Congress hold hearings. That is the work they did, but it was also a part of international dialogue. So we would have seen the Rapporteur on Human Rights and Cruelty talk about this case in particular being the example of what you should not do in a state. So who they were, in short, were men who devoted their lives to service, and men that made sure that they made an impact every place their foot traveled. So their impacts were in prison when they were in prison, and out in society when they left. They never stopped the work. And they're to be honored amongst the servants that we all respect and honor in community. These are men that deserve the same honor and reverence. So we should speak their names when we speak of anybody who did public service to this country, because that is the level of impact that they made.
Thank you for that. And I guess two follow-up questions, King, is how did this Louisiana State Prison get the name Angola, and how did the name Angola 3 come about?
Okay, and Angel, let me say this, Angel, thank you so much for that. I was untouched. You did it all. But anyway, I was hoping you had the last word. But how did that happen? And maybe she will. But how did that happen? How did we become the Angola Three? First, it was, and let me say this first. Actually, Zulu was supposed to. Kenneth Zulu Whitmore was supposed to have an interview and talk about his particular case. He's another person who became involved as a result of Herman. Herman met him some years earlier, and when he ultimately came to CCR, he also became a member of the Black Panther Party. He remains, in prison right now. But to get to you, I just want to give you some background, because I may flow into that. But how we became the Angola Three was because prior to that time it was the Angola Four. And Angel had all the information. I don't have to call their name. She knows the name. But there was the Angola Four. Albert and Herman were the main ones whom they, even though, like Angel pointed out, without any evidence, make a long story short, they convicted them. There was the Angola Four, and then it became Angola 2, because Gilbert Montague got exonerated, and Chester Jackson was the one. He got some years for the ones who became confidential informant to the state, openly. He wasn't so confidential, but became a person who utilized the system as it was, to take advantage of it, because the system had projected Herman and Albert and anybody affiliated with the Black Panther Party to be the culprit in this particular deal. And even though I wasn't there, I was even charged with the thing that Albert was charged with that got them in and this became a major thing in the suit, because the contention that I wasn't even in prison and I was still suspected of being 90 miles away and involved in something. But it was the Angola 4 at one time. Gilbert Montague and Chester Jackson. Gilbert got exonerated because a free man got in the way with him who liked him for some reason and gave testimony for him, and he got exonerated. But it was Herman and Albert who were the ones who bear the buck of it. So when that happened, it became Angola 2. On the defense committee, there were people who were sent in to be part of the defense committee who were sent in by the FBI. I know one of the person's name because they came to see us. We found all this out later. They came in to investigate what was going on. Anyway, after that time, when Gilbert and all these Gilbert and Chester did what they did, it became the Angola 2. At that time, I was in the New Orleans Parish prison, had escaped, had been on the 5th level, had become a member of the Black Panther Party by then, because I was in the parish prison at the same time, even though I wasn't on C1, I was on C3. The Panthers was on C1. Herman and Albert ultimately went to C1, and they ultimately became Panthers. I was on C3, but we communicated and so forth, and so on. And it so happened is that I was even though I was not in Angola when none of this thing took place, I wasn't there. I think it was some weeks before I was sent to Angola when this incident had happened. But nevertheless, I was placed on the investigation for it. And so when Gilbert and not Gilbert Black, we call him, Chester Jackson did what they did when the state got rid of them and separated them from Herman and Albert and cast it all on Herman and Albert. Albert decided and Herman decided to, they had sent me from Angola, like I say, from Paris prison to Angola, and had all put the militant labor on me, and they placed me, in CCR where Herman and Albert was, and so, and to tell the truth, I had to become a full-fledged Panther, and I wanted to be when I heard of this situation that took place with Herman and Albert. If I was going to be anyway in prison, and even though I had the ultimate idea to get away from it, but I wanted to really be where Herman and Albert was, to give those brothers support, because I understood what was taking place, and that was one of the reasons why. But Albert understood this. To make a long story short, Albert understood this. When it became the Angola 2, Albert and Herman debated. They locked King up, put him and got him under investigation for the same thing we are. He's a member of the Black Panther Party, and he's loyal and blah, blah, blah. And I think it was Albert's insistence that it become the Angola 3. To make a long story, make a long story long, or make a short story, it became the Angola 3. It became the Angola 3, and Herman Albert and like Gilbert Montague and Chester Jackson, they receded into the background of derelicts or whatever you want to refer to it as. Herman and Albert emerged, and Albert brought me into the picture, and this is how it became the Angola 3. It was, look, can I tell you something, Ron? You wouldn't believe this. You ain't. I told Albert said, King, we want, I said, oh, no. See, I do no, this is for, I said, I'm going to get out. I said, this is for you all. I said, I know, Angola 2, blah, blah, blah. And Albert insisted. And when I think about that, I say, wow. But Albert insisted that it become the Angola Three. And when he did that, he don't know what he did. He bind me to something that I could not. You know, I knew one thing when I left prison, Ryan, that I didn't know what I was going to do. But I do know one thing. There's no way in the world I had went through all of the stuff that I had went through, and I was going to go out and live a lackadaisical lifestyle at voice from what. But I could have pled guilty and got 15 years and been out years ago. It wasn't about that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was about morality. It was about other. So you know, it was about a lot of things. It was about me, my growth as well. But that's how it became the Angola Three. Albert insisted that I become the Angola Three, and it is the Angola Three in which I imagined it was destined to become.
Mm-hmm. And I heard from Gerald Horn and Mumia that the prison itself, the Louisiana Maximum Security State Prison, Angola, got its name from the place where the African captives came from. Is that accurate?
Oh yeah, you alluded to that. I'm sorry, you had asked about that too. But no, it takes its name from the country Angola. You know,
so
that's where it takes its name from. Because say it again, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were finished, and I was getting ready to add something. You can go ahead and finish.
No, what I was saying was, he had asked me a little asked about how to get his name, and I never alluded to that. But Ryan had begun bringing it up. But yes, Angola does get his name from the country Angola, because many of the slaves housed that area during slavery. During the period of slavery, many of them housed that particular area in Angola. They decided to make it call it Angola, and like I said, it was the biggest prison in the land. It had more land than any other prison around the country. So yeah, it became that's how it gets its name. And of course, it has other names. It is known as the bottom. Also, it is known as the heat. You know, in some cases, because even though it's a low area, it's higher in other places. And then they call it heat also because it was noted for sugar cane. And of course, I cut sugar cane. My first stay there, I cut sugar cane. And that was the main crop during that time. So it gets its name also, from the heap, because there's when you're cutting sugar cane, you got the two flies and you got the two heaps, left and right. You got the left and right fly and the heap. And when you're heaping, they call it the heap. That was some name that prisoners began calling it, because that's what really they were doing, heaping cane, because they had 80 acres of land that was nothing but sugar cane that really provided sugar for the whole state of Louisiana and subsequently Texas and other places, Cuba and lots of other places.
So what I wanted to add was that was a question that I always had as well when I started getting involved with this, was how did this become the Angola Three? And I wanted to add a few things. Herman Wallace and Albert Woodfox were charged with the same crime behind bars. Robert King was not. And so I often wondered, how was that possible, since there were different cases that they would become joined in this struggle? And as Albert explained it to me, is ultimately what made them targets was the fact that in those days, the language they used was that they were radicals, right? So the administration collectively viewed them as radicals because they were affiliated with the Black Panther Party. So King was not at Angola at the moment that Albert and Herman get accused of this particular offense. But when he does get shipped into Angola, he had already spent time on that Panther tier in New Orleans. So he was bearing the brand Panther as well. So he kind of arrives there with this target on his back, also describing him as a radical. And they have now developed already a reputation as being radicals. So they became a part of a collective struggle, as Albert identified it to me. And more importantly, each one of these men played into a relationship that improved the next. And so their unique blending of talent made them join into a struggle that became known as the Angola Three. And that was kind of the motivation for that. And then to expand on that secondary question about the naming of this, in Louisiana, during chattel slavery, they had always been, places that you would hold people who broke the law, but we never wanted to really have a lot of Black folks held during chattel slavery because the value of those Black bodies was labor, right? So we didn't use jails at that point to incarcerate Black folks. We dealt with them on a plantation and quickly put them back to work. So who you would normally see locked up during chattel slavery would have been white offenders. Well, that paradigm shifts, and it shifts for good reason at the end of the Civil War. And this is an important piece of Angola history. There is a Civil War general named Major Samuel James, who fought on the Confederate side, which means he is fighting to keep slaves. And when Civil War ends, all of these Confederate generals are rendered unemployed, right? They don't have any more plantations. They've been destroyed. They don't have work anymore because they can't be slave owners. And so they start trying to figure out what are they going to do in this new reconstructed Louisiana. And so Samuel James uses his finesse to go to the Louisiana legislature and start to convince them that you have released all of these Black folks, right? And we know they're bad people. That's why we used to have to beat them so bad. And that's why we used to have to lock them into those plantations and limit their freedom, because they have to be watched. And so he produced that theory before the legislature and came up with this idea that they're gonna start committing crimes. So we need to start thinking about when those bad people start committing those crimes, what are we gonna do with them? And he used his genius to introduce to Louisiana this idea that there would be a place to house those people, because remember, we didn't have a need for that before because they were dealt with on those plantations. So where were we gonna house them now? We would engage in the business of convict leasing. And every time somebody is convicted of a crime in Louisiana, they would be able to be leased out for free labor. Now, the beauty of this scheme was that where were they going to be leased to work? Back on those very plantations. And who owned several of those plantations? This man named Major Samuel James. So this former Confederate general really is the person who introduces post-Civil War this idea of convict leasing. And he's the one that tells the legislature that we need to start getting laws now because these people are bad. And so guess what laws we get? Vagrancy, right? So if you don't have a place to go during the day, you're a criminal. And once we brand you a vagrant, we now can put you into these convict leasing settings. And who's going to profit off of these leases? The former Confederate general. And which plantation did he own? It was the plantation that we all know to be Angola. So that is the one of his many plantations he owned. And so what we have to confront here is that, and this is true in most of the southern states, what I'm speaking of is Louisiana, but this history exists in Mississippi. So when you talk about Parchment, it's going to be the same history. So what we really have to understand is that this man taught us that we had a crime problem. But ultimately, we didn't have a crime problem. What we needed to do was use laws to criminalize. And so we use the law to criminalize so that we produce criminals by way of law. And that is that legacy that we're speaking of now when we talk about Angola. It was about producing people so that we could get that body back into this free labor system. And so there was a financial incentive for us having this place called Angola. And unfortunately, I can't tell you a lot of that has changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess another question, thank you for that history. And you had talked about this a bit, Professor Allen Bell, was the conditions in Angola, the conditions in solitary, because as we know, the Angola Three, including Robert King, had spent decades in solitary confinement. Albert Woodfox had spent either 43 or 44. I see both numbers out there, and arguably the longest in U.S. history, was held longest in the U.S. history, arguably the world, in solitary confinement. But King, can you give us an idea of what conditions are like behind the wall, what conditions are like, particularly in solitary confinement and Angola?
Uh, yeah, I imagine I could because the conditions altered because of things that were done over the period of time. You have to understand that that this was a long period of time, and the conditions from which in 1972, in which we kind of had. When I say we, I'm talking about collectively, Herman Wallace and myself, along with other people. We initiate fast with other people, and we got some changes, done within the prison itself. But it wasn't always like that. So your initial question is, I'm sorry, what the initial question is, which?
What he's
Hello?
asking you is to kind of help him get
Yeah.
a mental picture of what it was like for you to exist in solitary confinement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so those conditions altered, as I pointed out at different times, but they altered with the things that we did. Because at one time when we first went to, when they first sent us to, we were getting 1 hour out on the shower, or 15 minutes initially, and then you got 1 hour. You didn't go on a yard. It wasn't until some things happened that caused us to go on a yard. But initially, so what I'm saying is this: that over the years, because of our input and our struggling to change conditions, because we were becoming adept in law and understanding how other people were struggling, and we could do the same thing, and we wanted to effect some changes. And we also understood this, that our best way of doing things was to go on hunger strikes. And we had numerous of hunger strikes. And it's kind of ironic, but this got the attention of the folks, after 3-4 days, a lot quicker than people anticipated, because for whatever reason that they didn't want to, I have no idea why, but this got their attention. And I think it was as a medical and a doctor reason, because they had to show, in spite of the fact that we were treated less than, fair humans, they had to, they were responsible for our well-being and care. And if it come about as a result of neglect gross neglect on their part, they would stand for that. So that was some things that they did, but it wasn't all that accurate. Over the years, we got some things changed. We were fed almost like animals. I mean, the food wasn't that good, but yeah, I'm not gonna say it was really bad. It was good food that was cooked bad a lot of times. And yeah, that's what it was. It was good. And so, but then again, and the person who was in CCR, closed cell restriction, was the one who bear the brunt of this food. But it's kind of ironic how that changed which is another story, when Herman Wallace and I and just began sending us, because people were trying to get to CCR because that was the best place in the world. Everybody wanted, everybody wanted the at that time to come to the CCR. But there was a different time when the food was served. I mean, it was poorly. It was bad. It was done in a manner, especially during this particular time, in the early 70s. They would just throw your food underneath. The haulers would come in and put your food on and fix it out somewhere out of your sight, and just throw it under the table, and it would hit the balls. I mean, it was really unsanitary. And I think it was Albert was the one who brought that to our attention, and said, if we're going to struggle, this is one of the things that we should struggle for. And I think this has ultimately led to the holes being cut in the balls. But there were periods of time in which, if we would not have struggled for better conditions, as Angela, Professor Bell alluded to, if we had not struggled for better conditions, we would have languished in those, inferior conditions on and on and on, and there would not have been any effort at all to change things. But because we decided that, and especially after joining the Black Panther Party, we understood the dignity involved with this. No, we had to stoop down and get our food beneath a dirty door. Why we have to do this? No, you go to the dungeon and you will find a hole cut in the door. If a person was doing time, because everybody went to the dungeon, for a little infraction, you go to the dungeon and then they would feed you. They had a slide in the door. But here you are in a cell for years and years and years, and they slide your food underneath the dirty door. It hits the bottom of the door, and you have no redress. So these are the type of things that we've kind of begin to focus on at that time. And at one time, like I said, it was different. And at one time, we didn't get contact visits. At one time, we didn't get privilege on the yard. I mean, it was as a result of the efforts that we made. It was something that was changing, continuously, because we were troubling the water, so to speak. And they had to come up to par with especially federal codes, because during this time, the federal code was giving guidelines in which prisoners were learning these things. And they were making state code apply these federal guidelines that ordinarily they would not do. So it was a period, it was a fluctuating type of a period, Ryan and Angela, where we, we did things gradually, but we first understood what we needed to do. And I'm so glad I was surrounded with some people who like-minded, who understood this, and that we were able to accomplish this. But it wasn't that they changed, the prison changed and altered because it wanted to. It changed and altered because, we trouble the water, so to speak.
And
I went and looked over a few letters that I had received from Albert and both Herman, and I want to respond through some of what they communicated to me as well about this. Both of them described the solitary cells as being extremely small and very uncomfortable. So just if you want to get a visual, you might think of something like a 6x9, which is about the functional equivalent of a parking spot. Both of them described the sink, the toilet being in that cell, the bed being in that cell, the bed being very hard. There never being comfortable pillows, the temperatures being extreme. And one letter I'm looking at that I wanted to talk to you about, Albert writes, and I'm quoting, "It is so hot right now that I'm dripping with sweat. I have to lay a towel across the paper so that I won't soak this paper with water. I feel like I'm sitting in the midst of hot water. It's hard to describe the heat." And then some of Albert's letters in the winter would talk about him never having enough blankets because it was always extremely cold. And so what you want to imagine is that you have all of that stuff in that cell for a reason, because you're not going to go out. And so when you use the restroom, you're going to do it in that cell. That desk that was there, it's a really small, compact desk. So you're going to write in that cell. You're not going to have good lighting in that cell often. Sometimes there are bars where you can see through. Sometimes the doors are metal where you cannot. And so that would vary depending on which facility they were in. The lighting was always an obstacle. So you'll see many of the folks who are submitted to this type of housing having visual challenges because they are not able to really get adequate lighting in order to keep their eyes working properly. They develop a lot of health conditions because of the limited mobility. So you're going to have a lot of struggles with joint problems and arthritis and things of that nature. Psychosis, obviously, because you don't get the kind of stimulation that you need because you're not interacting with other people the way you should. What interaction you do have is daily trauma. So you're hearing people who have lost their minds. You're hearing people screaming in agony. You're hearing people grieving and mourning. You're hearing people that are being sprayed with tear gas. You're hearing people yelling and cursing. Everything, all the stimuli that you do experience is unpleasant. So it takes a toll on a person. Another letter that I received from Albert, and I'm going to quote what he describes. He says, and this is a June 2011 letter, solitary confinement has evolved from its original purpose, which was a time for people to reflect on their actions. Solitary is no longer just about self-reflection. It is about solacing people. It is about controlling their ideas. Solitary is now a death chamber. It forces people into suicide or insanity. It is in fact a torture house. Breaking one's will is the goal of solitary confinement today. He says that solitary confinement is in fact a deadly weapon, and that is a quote. Another quote from Albert, he says that as all of these conditions we discussed, they're bad, they're all very harmful, but he said there was one thing the Angola Three mastered. And I'm quoting to you, Albert said that our cells became schools. They became study halls. They became places of debate and philosophy. We turned our tiers into a community instead of a place of isolation. We were taught that we were important as people on that tier, and we showed a sense of unity. That tier made us stronger when the prison was trying to make us weaker. And so somehow in the story, we must understand that yes, they were submitted to these brutal, torturous conditions, but it was the will that they manifested in response to this that I think that is worth discussing. Albert often talked about how he and the other men in the Angola Three refused to be institutionalized, which was the easier thing to do, but they were determined to always maintain a sense of humanity and dignity, which is a difficult thing to accomplish under these conditions. But to their credit, they found a way to do just that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that King said this, but people that are in solitary, you know, they spend 23 hours a day in lockdown by themselves and get at most an hour out still by themselves to quote unquote exercise in a very small area. One quote that I saw from Albert Woodfox was that he stated that, where is this quote of, that they turned the cells from death chambers to schools and debate halls to keep the beasts of madness at bay. And then I have a friend who spent 26 years in prison, much of it in solitary. And one of the questions I always asked him is how did he get by? And Albert Woodfox talks about how it was the Black Panther Party and his mother's strength and perseverance that helped him get by. And he's quoted as saying, "I never saw the look of defeat in my mother's face, no matter how bad things were. And this is one of the things that kept me going." King, or before we go to the next question, or Professor Angela Bell, is there anything more that you want to cover on this topic of life behind the walls?
I do want to also add that in my research, one of the harms that I found, in addition to all of the scientific information that we talked about, was that when you submit a person to these conditions, which means that they're alone, that they're not able to ever leave that cell to be able to work in any facility, in any aspect of that facility, they never get the opportunity to develop any references. So they're disadvantaged by way of the structure that they're existing under, because, for example, when they go for those reviews, there is no paper from a reference to say, this person does a good job during the day, give them a chance. Or when they go for parole, they don't have those references because the housing assignment eliminates that opportunity. And that is an internal disadvantage that's built into this. But also about Albert's mother, because if I think there's any topic that we discuss more than anything else, it was his mother. And one of the things that I really struggled as I'm trying to process the loss of all of this is one of those lessons that I learned from Albert is when you are faced with oppression or injustice, you have a choice to make. Either you're going to succumb to it or you're going to survive it. And there's two things that Albert taught me about surviving injustice. One of which is that you never look inward at that injustice all day. You don't just ingest that. You always look outward. And when you look outward, what I want to always remember about Albert is that the state, for all of those years, had custody of his body. But the state never could get custody of Albert's mind. And that is an important thing to understand about his level of defiance. His survival abilities was that he would never surrender that piece of him to the state. He kept that intact. And then the second thing you spoke about was his mother, which is he always would tell me about the mother. And I often would try to reduce that to some level of understanding. And what I could come up with is that when you're faced with an injustice like this, you have to have an anchor. And that's what his mother was. She was his anchor. And you have to be able to clench that anchor. You have to get a grip on it, and you have to never release that anchor. And that's what she was for Albert. And so one day I said to Herman, send me a poem. I want to put it on my desk so that when my students come in, I can share the poem. And so Herman wrote back something about, I'm not a poet woman. I don't write poetry, but ultimately he sent me that poem. And so once I got it from Herman, I wrote Albert and said, well, I have this displayed on my desk from Herman. I would like one from you. And so what I got back is what I want to share in response to this question. It is a poem that Albert wrote, and it is entitled Echoes. And it is a tribute to his mother, who was his anchor. And I'm going to read the poem if I'm able. So, echoes of wisdom I often hear, a mother's strength softly in my ear. Echoes of womanhood shining so bright, echoes of mother's wit in the darkest of nights. Echoes of wisdom on my mother's lips, too young to understand what was in her gentle kiss. Echoes of love, echoes of fear, arrogance of manhood that simply would not let me hear. Echoes of heartache I still hold close as I mourn the loss of my one true heroes. Echoes from a mother's womb, heartbeats held so dear. Life begins with my first tears, echoes of footsteps taken in the past, echoes of manhood standing in the looking glass, echoes of motherhood gently and near, echoes of a lost mother I will always hear. And that was authored by Albert.
Thank you for sharing that. King, is there anything else you want to add on this topic of life behind the walls?
No, Ryan, Angela, it's all been said, and I've taken it all in.
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to say, I keep forgetting to mention it, was that the UN has stated that any time above 13 days in solitary confinement constitutes torture. And so when you think about the fact that the Angola Three, spent decades, almost half a century, in solitary, behind the walls and in solitary, that's, as per the UN, a gigantic violation of international law and a gigantic form of torture.
And I would add to that, Louisiana is a very conservative jurisdiction. And so one of the challenges in doing this type of work around this case is to get people who trust the justice system to care about something like this. And so when I was working on this project of how do we educate people and have them care enough about Albert to come out to court or to serve, faithfully on these juries, it dawned on me that, torture is not just an international principle, but torture is the language spoken by the faith-based community. And so one of the ways that we were able to educate Louisiana residents about this case was, in fact, holding a prayer service and also partnerships that the Angola Three team did with the National Association Against Torture. So the movement expanded because we were able to speak language that other people could hear. And so some people will not hear racial injustice, but they certainly do hear the language of torture and understand that it is a moral imperative to act when people are submitted to these kinds of injustices.
Thank you.
And yes, I'm sorry, and also may I add, everything that's been said is well said. I need to say this too, also in conjunction, and Angela just alluded to. Can let me elaborate a little bit. Amnesty International, all of its affiliates, it got hold of this case. It saw it as a human rights violation as a result of what had happened over here. And they took it upon themselves. And Albert, even when Albert got out, he and I went to France, England. We went to Belgium together. We went to the Netherlands together. And even before then, we were, as a result of Amnesty International getting on board. So they got behind us, even though like Mumia, they got behind us like they got behind Mumia. And I think for whatever reason, I don't know. I think it's, when Mumia eventually was released and got off of death row, that kind of took a lot of away from things. But our case dealt with innocence, total innocence, and it wasn't as a result of we were asking. Neither one of us was asking the state, for mercy or anything like this. And, and so we were asking for justice, and we were asking for morality. And ultimately, and Amnesty took that up on themselves at one time. I brought them in because at one time, Amnesty did not interfere with, the state's issue. When it came down to prisoners, they made an exception in our case.
Thank you for sharing that. I guess one of the last questions I have is, what are some of the lessons we can learn from the life of Albert Woodfox?
King, do you want to go first?
I'll let you go first and last, Angela. This is your stage. I think you could address that much better than I could.
Okay, so one of the immediate lessons for me, because I see this through a legal lens, is the fact that what I would hope people would understand from Albert's struggle is that courts have been given trust that they have never earned in this country, and particularly in this state. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes people will see a ruling from a court, and they will see a ruling maybe from a higher court and conclude that you must have done this thing because your appeal was denied, right? Or because the jury found you guilty. And so one of the things that I would hope people would learn from this case is that we have placed too much of a reliance on rulings that come out of courts, because oftentimes, because of the pace courts work, because of the financial incentive involved in running a justice system that is not funded properly, courts make mistakes. And Albert and Herman and King's case are all evidence of that. Because in each of these cases, you would have seen years and years and years of courts denying relief in the states. And then they ultimately had to go over to the federal courts, and it was many more years of fights. And so if we learn anything, it is to be very discerning about trusting any outcome that comes from any court in any criminal case. And I say that as a lawyer in this state with a degree now for over 20 years. I've just seen enough injustice to know that it is not safe to place a lot of value in any criminal case. The next thing is that, in one of Albert's letters, we used to have these book studies, and, he would tell me about books he's reading. And if I read the book, I would tell him parts that I loved. And in one of his letters, he was telling me about him rereading Malcolm X's book. And he said to me all the things about the book he loved, but he ended the letter by saying there's one piece of this book that means the most to me, and it is the way it shows me that true change is possible. And that is the second thing that we want to always remember about Albert, is that he made a true, genuine change in his life from what he was doing as a very young person with a lack of understanding and growth, to a very mature-minded man who spent his entire life trying to atone for any harms that he had inflicted upon his community. And he is a testament to anybody struggling with change, that change and reform can in fact be accomplished. Another thing that I would like us to remember about Albert comes from a lesson that Herman actually taught me. And that was when I first went in to meet Herman in person. Herman asked me, he said, "Professor, which are you? Are you a leader or are you a revolutionary?" And I really didn't have an answer for Herman. I had to really think about this. And he said, well, when I got ready to leave, he said, "I'm going to tell you what I want you to consider." He said, "The leader is that person who is seeking to accomplish something. Often they can do it in their lifetimes. But the revolutionary is the person who is seeking to accomplish something for their grandchildren and for the next generation. And they understand that they're doing work that they might not ever witness in their lifetime." And so I offer to you, when we think about who Albert was and how we should remember him, he was most certainly a revolutionary. And then also there's so many things about Albert that you cannot hear, you just have to see. And what I mean by that is his true value. What made him rich is often what he never said. So Albert was a person who understood the value of words. He used few of them. But when Albert spoke, it was certainly of meaning and worth. Albert also understood how to fight tactically. So he didn't just open fire and just spray randomly. He understood how to target and how to fight only when necessary, but when necessary with purpose. He also understood what I believe the Bible says to us is the greatest of all the commandments, which is love. And Albert lived that biblical truth to the end of his life. He loved animals, he loved humans, he loved people of all geographic dimensions and all races and all struggles. Albert loved genuinely. And so we want to always remember that about Albert. And of course, that he believed in the Panther principles of service, and he lived a life of service until the very end as well. And he was certainly a man of great courage. This is a man who served in an organization that the United States government set out to neutralize, and he fully understands that. And this is a man that took a position in a prison that was segregated, and understood that he was on the very end of a power dynamic, and he took a position anyway. And so that I would ask that we remember him as a man of great courage. And then finally, I would ask that we remember him as a man of steel. And when I say man of steel, I speak about the poem that Herman Wallace wrote, that I spoke of earlier, and Herman termed that poem the Man of Steel. And so in my last minutes, I would like to just share that poem, and if, of course, Robert King may add more, but the Man of Steel, I speak of not just Herman Wallace, who wrote this speaking of himself, but I'm describing all three of the Angola Three as men of steel. And so I go on now to quote Herman's poem. Herman says, "My keepers believe that I am the man of steel, ripping and running in and out of my life as if this shit ain't real. They frame me for murder, and when their conspiracy is exposed and they are all deposed, the judge declares case closed. Equal access to justice, equal access to rule. Doctrines never meant for the man of steel, but to terminate the years of his indomitable will. Maybe my soul is that of concrete. Maybe it is that of the wind. Maybe it is that of fire. Maybe it is the spirit of the people, the spirit of the ancestors. Whatever my keepers wish my soul to be, the man of steel has always been free." And so I would end with my final thought that Albert never had any interest in getting out of prison. Albert's interest was in being free, and he is finally free, and I think we should celebrate that.
Thank you, thank you. King, do you have any thoughts on this? Lessons that we can learn from the life?
No, anything else I'll save it for the memorial, which is the 8th of next month. And if I say anything, I'll have it for that. It's all been said.
Yeah.
And we'll be sure to send you a copy of the memorial invite so that you could also share it with your viewers.
Thank you very much. And there is one quote I wanted to share that that I heard from Albert King, and it came out a few days after his release. He was quoted as saying, "The Black Panther Party may not exist today, but we exist, and we will continue to struggle to free our comrades and stand shoulder to shoulder to take on the daily injustices of America," which I think sort of mirrors what Professor Alan Bell was saying about, how he's a revolutionary and his goal was to be free, not just to be innocent and released. And so it's just so powerful, his quotes and the poems that you shared. Before we close, is there anything more that either of you want to say on this, just on this tribute to Albert Woodfox?
King?
No, not on this. Not on this show. Angela might have something she wants to say, but
the only final thing.
I'm open.
Okay, so King says no, and I'll just say the last thing that I want to say is that when Albert was experiencing his last days, Albert was surrounded by the team of people who loved him. And I would just want to make sure that no one leaves this interview thinking that he grieved and was sad and was destitute and alone, because he lived his days always with family, friends, with purpose to the very end of his life. And I'm just so grateful to know that we were all able to experience all of his life, the good parts as well as the bad parts, and that he did not depart this world without knowing that he was loved. And Albert had a awareness of the years of support that he got from the public. And he spoke often with words of gratitude for the way people supported him over those years. And I just want to make sure that people do realize that he didn't take any of that for granted. He felt all the love, all the prayers, all the support, and all the concern, and he spoke of it often.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you both for coming on the show, Professor Alan Bell. Thank you so much for your time. And King, it's an honor just to meet you and hear from you. And thank you for everything you've added. And thank you for your life and dedication.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure. Thank you, Professor Bell. Thank you a lot.
Well,
Okay.
I'm just honored for this occasion for people to get a window into his life. So thank you very much for the attention you brought to this case.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure.
Okay, thank you
All
both.
right.